keep going in Matthew, right where we, in a sense, where we left off last time, although I've been kind of jumping around because of the way Matthew has structured his section here on these parables. But still very much in Matthew's fourth section about how the disciples will believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. That's going to pretty much be the idea overall until we get to about halfway through chapter 16. More of that will start coming together when we get out of the parables. The parables force us to slow down and take more time with some of these passages, but that's generally what's happening at this point in Matthew. But we are in this section of parables in chapter 13, the parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom. And we are now in the parable of the weeds of the field, which requires us to read two passages actually. We have to read the parable itself that Jesus gives. It's actually the second parable he tells. And then we have to read the interpretation that comes a little later on in the passage. So we'll read both. First, the parable starts in verse 24. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servant said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" So there's the parable. The interpretation comes a little later, but that's in verse 36. "And he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field.' He answered, 'The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the close of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." So today's message, I'm going to try to focus on the main point of this parable. I had a whole page of notes of other things I could say, but they're just kind of stray details. I want to really keep this on the main idea. The title that I came up with is Reaping, Wrath, and Reward, which pretty neatly summarizes some of the big ideas in there, but doesn't really tell you a whole lot about where we're going maybe. The main idea, as I have isolated it from this parable, is something like this. In spite of Satan's continuing hostility, Christians should wait for the judgment when God will reward them. So you kind of move through the major plot of this story as it unfolds, and just following those points there. Now, for my outline, to make things a little complicated here, I decided I had to divide this message into two parts. So there are two halves to this message. So we're going to be doing one thing for the first part and then kind of switch over and get to what I really want to talk about. In the first half, I'm going to be telling you what this parable is not meant to do, which I think is rather important because I think on this parable, it's very easy to get sidetracked by something that is not the main point. So the first half is telling you what this parable is not supposed to be doing. And the second half, I'll return to my main point as I gave it earlier. The main point being that in spite of Satan's continuing hostility, Christians should wait for the judgment when God will reward them. So you have that two-half format coming up in this message. To bind it all together, I decided that I want you, as you go through this parable and as we talk about it, I want you to remember something in particular. And that is the troubles we have in this world and what hope we have against those troubles. So if you want a kind of binding thought to keep your mind focused, that's what I would give you. Our troubles in this world and the hope that we have against them. As I was writing this message, which is actually a couple months ago, so this was actually fresh news when I was writing these notes, we had this incident back in January. For those of you that remember this being talked about, we had that team of missionaries going over to Iraq, and they had that container of clothing and supplies going to them, and it was stopped by officials in Turkey who stopped it and interrupted the whole process. The whole reason being they found out it was going to Christians, most likely, and they just decided to mess with our plans and the plans of God's kingdom and just get in the way of everything. And totally interfered with the good plans being done to come to the aid of some very needy people. I mean, even on a purely humanistic way of thinking, what we were doing was not wrong, but hey, it's done by Christians, so let's get in the way of things, right? Well, it's a very troublesome thing. We were all very frustrated about that. It was a topic of several emails and some prayer. Being troublesome because, first of all, we have no power over there in Turkey to punish those men. We have no way to appeal to any authority over there to bring some kind of retribution for their corruption, really. We have nothing to do. We can't do anything about that. We also have no further contact with those men or about them. So if any kind of justice ever comes, we're not going to know about it. So we don't have the satisfaction of saying, aha, God has done right. We're not going to hear anything about that. Also, for all we know, they're going to do that same thing to another group of Christians in the future. They're just going to keep messing with the plans of churches. So how do you, in the midst of that kind of opposition that we encounter so often, how do you keep your confidence and your peace and your sanity? How do you keep going level, the way a Christian ought to be going? Well, I think this parable actually answers that question. So as we go through the parable, I want you to have that in your mind as a kind of governing thought. So we start with the first half of my message. What this parable is not meant to do. And for that I will say this parable is not primarily a warning about false believers. I became convinced at that point and more emphatic about that point as I started studying the parable. But this parable is not primarily a warning about false believers. Now, if you have any preconceived views on this parable, the ways you've read it before, and you brought them with you tonight, it's time for you either to defend those views or amend them, depending on what you hear tonight. It's totally up to you in your own mind as you think about what I'm saying. But I've come to have a very specific view of this parable and a view of what it is not doing, and I do not think we're actually getting a warning about false believers here, which is the way most Christians have read the parable, certainly the way I have commonly read the parable, as I have read it in the past. Most Christians do believe that this parable, the main point of it, is to warn Christians about the existence of false believers. They begin with a very basic question, a very understandable question. Who are the children of the devil mentioned in this parable? You have these weeds. Jesus says they represent the sons of the evil one. Well, who are they more specifically? Most Christians answer that question by saying that they are false believers. They are people who profess to be Christians but who ultimately are not. Now, Christians normally identify the weeds as false Christians for one reason in particular, and that is because the weeds look a lot like wheat. That is the chief mode of argument for thinking. Anyone who has done any kind of looking into this parable, even people of a more scholastic nature, they come away with that observation and they say, therefore, we're dealing with false Christians. This word here used for these weeds, I did some study on this because it was kind of a critical point for a while. The word is zitzanion. It refers to a specific kind of weed called darnel, or darnel. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Darnel, darnel, don't know. I'm going to say darnel. Darnel weed, okay? That's what it refers to. Now, darnel is actually pretty well known in the world of agriculture even now. It's considered a very common pest plant. I mean, after all, it's a weed. You don't want that growing in your farm, growing in your garden. It's such a problem, though, because in its early stages, it actually does look a whole lot like wheat. It's only in its later stages, as both plants grow together, that you finally figure out you have two different kinds of plants in your field, and you have to do something about that. But at first, they look very, very similar. Darnel weeds, and then the wheat plant where you get bread, like they look very, very similar as they're at first growing together. So you kind of get the idea from that you're dealing with false believers, right? I mean, you have these weeds that look a lot like the authentic wheat plant, and then later on it's like, oh no, we have weeds in the field. Well, you kind of have that same idea with false believers. You thought this person that was in your church maybe was a genuine, sincere follower of Christ. Later events in their life prove that they were never at all regenerated, that there was no grace in them, and you only find out later that that was the case. Well, a lot of people seize upon that idea as they read the parable, and that's really one of the big arguments that these weeds here refer to false believers. And so we get the idea very naturally from that the chief idea of the parable is to just warn us that there are going to be false believers. Jesus gives us this heads up that among Christians there are going to be those who are not actually disciples, who don't actually have the grace of God working within them. However, as I was studying this parable, I came to have a rather different view of things. I came to believe that this parable does not actually talk about a warning about false believers. I don't think it focuses on false believers, nor do I think it gives a warning about them. I really did pull quite a 180. None of these parables have turned out the way I thought they would as I was studying them. This one may be the most radical example of that, but my way of reading the parable really changed in regard to what, if anything, it's saying about false believers. Now, my primary reason for being skeptical about whether we have a warning about false believers, my primary reason for doubting that now is the interpretation provided by Jesus. We are very fortunate that this is one of the parables that Jesus himself interprets, having pity on his own disciples who ask him privately about it. Jesus spends no time warning us about false believers, but a lot of time promising judgment on the wicked. Right? When he gives his interpretation, there's nothing about false believers, but there's a lot about the final judgment. I'm going to reread Jesus' interpretation of the parable. Here in a few minutes, we'll go down and we'll read verse 36 and on again. But as I do that, I want you to ask yourself two questions. First question is, how much of this is a warning about false believers? How much of that interpretation is focusing your mind on the presence of false disciples among the church? And the second question to ask yourself is, how much of this is a promise of God's wrath for the wicked? How much of this is about the final judgment? So let's reread Jesus' interpretation. Verse 36, Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the close of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. On the one hand, not once does Jesus say anything like, beware of the false Christians in your midst. There's nothing in there about, this signifies that there will be false disciples. He doesn't say anything about that. On the other hand, Jesus does concern himself quite a bit with the certainty of wrath. He does talk quite a bit about the final judgment there. He spends actually 3 whole verses, as we count verses, in his interpretation, talking about the final judgment. Now, I want my interpretation to line up with the interpretation given by Jesus. Whatever he says, whatever he stresses as he is interpreting this parable, I want that to be my focus. I am a Christ follower. That includes how I interpret his parables. I want to interpret this parable the way Jesus does. And Jesus doesn't really show a whole lot of concern about false believers here, but he does show a concern about the certainty of wrath and final judgment. So I know this is kind of a radical change for the way many of you have probably read the parable, but for my part, I'm pretty doubtful of that now. I just really don't think, if you talk about false believers when you're talking about this parable, I really don't think you're hitting the idea on the head. I really think Jesus has his mind directed elsewhere as he tells this parable. Now on that note, we can go a little further, making this maybe even a little more radical than what I'm saying. I am no longer so certain that the weeds even represent false believers, which is a very big change for the way I've always read the parable, but I'm no longer so sure of that. They might. The weeds might actually represent false Christians, just like a whole lot of readers think. I think that's a plausible interpretation. I'm just not so sure of it. I couldn't really argue for it in a way that I find convincing. Now I have three major reasons for why I've come to doubt even that. And I want to just go through them here just to show you more of my thinking on the passage, maybe liberate you to ponder other possibilities as you read the passage. The first reason is that Jesus is very vague about who the weeds represent. I mean, he is not by any means definitive as he gives his interpretation. Look at verse 38 here. It says, "The field is the world, and the good seed is the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one." That is his only interpretive comment for who the weeds are. The weeds are the sons of the evil one. Now, Jesus is pretty vague there when you think about it, because that could be any kind of unbeliever, right? I mean, the sons of the evil one. That's not just false believers. I mean, that could be any unbeliever. Any kind of person that just does not follow Christ, the natural man. It's not very specific. Looking at verses 40 through 41, we can point out something else here. "Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers." That is maybe, if you want to, I guess you could consider it that way, a second interpretive comment on who the weeds are. They are causes of sin and all lawbreakers. Well, again, that's not very specific to false Christians, is it? And that could, again, be any kind of unbeliever. So, in this warning about false disciples, apparently, Jesus doesn't really nail it down that the weeds are false disciples. He doesn't really say anything to make that clear that that's what he's talking about, which I find really strange. If Jesus himself is going to be so vague, I fail to see why I should be more specific and say these weeds are a specific kind of unbeliever. Maybe we should just leave it general like Jesus does and just say they are unbelievers in general, whether false disciples or people who are openly hostile to Christianity. That's my first reason. Second reason for doubting that the weeds even represent false believers at all is that Jesus at no point interprets the similar appearance of wheat and darnel, which is the point I made toward the beginning about why Christians very often understand the parable the way they do. You have this common thing where you have this darnel weed, looks very similar to wheat, therefore you get the idea that maybe these weeds represent people who look like Christians but are not Christians. Well, if the common interpretation is correct, then the similarity between the wheat and darnel is critical to this parable, right? I mean, that's a big thing there. A lot of people, when they talk about this parable in their books or in their sermons, they go to that idea. What's interesting is that Jesus never goes to that idea. Even as he interprets the parable, he doesn't actually say, now remember, darnel looks very similar to wheat, and that's what I'm trying to signify here by people who look like Christians but are not. He never gets there. He never goes to the one place that most other Christians go when they interpret the parable, which I find very strange. You would think in his interpretation, he would give the disciples all the information they really need to know to make sense of the parable, and would point out at least the critical points of his parable. He doesn't seem to do that. So that's a big problem, I think. My final reason for doubting this idea that the weeds are specifically false believers is that there is another way, if you really want to push this, there is another way, I think, to interpret the similarity between the wheat and the darnel weeds that are growing here in this field. There's another way to understand that if you really want to go that direction. And that other way is perhaps the doctrine of predestination, which maybe you've never thought about with regard to this parable, and I never really did either. But the more I got to thinking about it, the more I realized that's a possible way to read the parable. Let's think about this. According to any biblical discussion of predestination, we're talking about biblical discussions of predestination, mind you, we have that very development, right? People say this. You maybe hear this said by any solid, sound scholar that talks about this. The only way to know whether someone is elect is if he first professes faith in Christ and then demonstrates his genuine faith by a changed life. His calling and election is only made sure by his later post-conversion lifestyle, right? You hear that all the time. Well, how do I know if I'm elect? And people, they bring this up as an objection. Maybe they bring it up as an actual concern. Maybe they're afraid they can't become a Christian because they're not elect. And we always tell them, the only way to know if you're one of the elect is if you repent and start following Christ, and if your lifestyle proves that the grace in your life is real, right? Which means there takes some time there to gain assurance of salvation. It takes some time to make your call and election sure, as Peter says over in one of his letters, right? So you have this time at first when you don't really know, is this person one of the elect or not? But then eventually it becomes certain as the grace of God becomes plain in that person's life. Well, wheat, darnel weeds. I mean, at the very beginning of the development, they look very similar. Impossible to tell the difference. But let it go a little longer. Eventually it gets to the point where you can say, that is wheat, those are weeds. You can do that later on. It's a very similar to development to what we very often say when we talk about predestination. It's another possible way, I think, to interpret this similarity between the wheat and the darnel weeds. Now, again, that may not even be a factor in the parable at all. As I said, Jesus doesn't really bring it up himself. That similar appearance there in the early stages of their growth. But if you think that is really important for the parable and you want to give some kind of interpretive stress to that, there's another way to view it. It doesn't just have to be false believers, real believers. It could be the elect and the reprobate. It's just another way of reading the parable. So having another way of reading it there, it makes it less likely, I think, that it has to be these false believers. For all those reasons, take them or leave them, I'm just not sure anymore that these weeds even represent false believers. I think it more likely that they represent just unbelievers in general, the sons of the evil one, the children of the devil. That's the way I've come to see it. So that again is just the first half of my message. Let me summarize that before moving on to the main point here. Just to give you my thought process as it exists right now as I move on into actually trying to interpret the parable. First, the weeds may or may not be false believers. Okay, I don't want to commit myself one way or another to that. I think there are options. I can't really choose one. I can see why you might say they're false believers, but I'm just not sure. I see reasons against that too. So there's one thing. Secondly, if the weeds are false believers, this parable is still not a warning about false believers. That's not the main point. That's not primarily where Jesus is going, because Jesus does not focus on that idea. And we want our focus to be where Jesus' focus is. So that's the second thing. Third, at very most, a warning about false believers can only be a secondary idea of this parable. Now, if you want to take those weeds as being false believers in particular, okay, I guess you can do that. Like I said, it's a plausible interpretation. And if you want to bring that up as you maybe teach on the parable or as you reflect on the parable, that's fine too, but it has to be a secondary point. Okay, I don't think it's the main thing Jesus is trying to say here. So just try to keep things in their proper place in your mind as you reflect on the parable and try to live by it. That whole way of reading the parable at best is a secondary point, not a primary point. Now, as for what the primary point actually is, need to get onto that. That's where I get to my second half. So we'll go there now. What is the actual main primary point of the parable of the weeds of the field? Well, the main idea is, I think, that in spite of Satan's continuing hostility, Christians should wait for the judgment when God will reward them. So that's my understanding of the main point of this parable. Now, hopefully that provides you with a topic just as good as the one I attacked. I know I'm kind of yanking out the rug from underneath you, maybe in the way you've typically read this parable. Hopefully I'm giving you something useful in its place. We'll see if that plays out. Now, of course, I want to explain why I view the parable this way, explain why I've identified this as the chief point of the parable. I've already mentioned that Jesus, in his own interpretation of the parable, stresses the final judgment and the wrath of God on unbelievers and the reward of the righteous. He gets there when he does his interpretation. Most of it is about that. So Jesus himself focuses on that idea surrounding the final judgment. So that's my one reason. That was the first thing that came across to me when I began studying this parable as to why that should be more of the main point. There's another factor, however, a second factor, and this one relates to some things I told you at the beginning of this chapter when we were studying how to study parables. The advice for learning lessons from a story parable. Right? I gave you those at the very beginning. I've been coming back to them as often as I can as we go through this chapter. I told you that some of the ways that you can learn the lesson from a parable is that you can learn from the parable's surprise, you can learn from the parable's characters, and you can learn from the parable's ending. So surprise, characters, ending. I told you to watch for those things in these parables because Jesus usually loads those with points. He wants you to learn things from them. Well, if we apply that advice to this parable, I think we arrive at the point that I have identified as the primary point of the parable. I think if you follow that basic advice that I gave you for studying parables, you will see that this parable itself is about exactly what I was saying, that in spite of Satan's continuing hostility, Christians should wait for the judgment when God will reward them. So that was how I came to that conclusion. Now I want to walk you through that and show you how I applied all three of those points of advice and how I arrived at meaning from them. It'll show you more of how to read these parables and show you at least how I understand this parable the way I do. So first of all, learning from the surprise. And the surprise is this: the children of the devil will continue to thrive alongside the children of the kingdom. That is your surprise point for this parable, that Satan's going to have people in the world just as God is going to have people in the world. They're going to be both together. Now, I call that a surprise because we remember the original context in which this parable was taught among the Jews there in Palestine who were eagerly awaiting the kingdom to come, right? Now, among the Jews, the typical belief was once the Messiah comes, there will be an end to all evil. God wins. End of discussion. Everything goes into hell that's wicked, and God exalts the righteous, and that's it. The end. There's a nice typical break there, gone, when the final judgment happens, because the final judgment happens when the Messiah comes. That's the typical way of viewing it among the Jews. Now, against that, Jesus comes and says this, verse 24 again, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also." Right? Now we know that this enemy and the weeds represents the devil and his children. You have Satan active in the world, creating, his own children, his own followers, people who are slaves to his will, really. Now Jesus has just asserted, therefore, that Satan is going to be active in the kingdom of God and that his children will flourish. So the devil's going to be out doing stuff, and the people who are the servants of the devil are going to be very much active, just as the devil is active. That is a great contradiction to what the Jews of the time were expecting. They were not expecting an active devil after the Messiah shows up. They were expecting a slaughtered devil, a defeated devil, a devil forever locked away along with all of his wicked followers. That's what they were expecting. Jesus gives them something else. And if you want to add a little bit more of a highlight to that, remember that this field in this parable represents the world. Jesus says that specifically in verse 38, the field is the world. So it's not just, Palestine or anything, it's the whole globe. It's the world, which means that the devil's sabotage is going to be a worldwide sabotage. His efforts to spread his children throughout the earth is going to cover the whole earth. The field is the world. So that's a very successful campaign that the devil is going to undertake after the Messiah has apparently arrived. Which again is very, very different than what the Jews were expecting. It would have been a surprising notion to them to hear someone say that there's going to be this kind of delay in the final defeat of Satan and this kind of success that Satan is going to have after the Messiah shows up. That's probably why Matthew includes the parable, actually. He being a writer very much to his own people, I think to Palestinian Jews trying to evangelize them and disciple them, he has to deal with things like this. He has to deal with these great differences between what the Jews were expecting and what actually happened when Jesus showed up. So it makes sense for Matthew to mention the parable, but it's still going to be really radical to that audience. It's not what they were expecting at all. But Matthew comes, and here in chapter 13, he's giving you his very full commentary of the kingdom of heaven and what it's like, very much communicating the nature of that kingdom. Part of that kingdom, part of the conquest of the kingdom of God is this conquest of Satan. I mean, he has stuff going on too. He is also going to have his children springing up throughout the world. Shocking but true. Let's not forget, of course, that this continued activity from Satan is hostility to the children of the kingdom that Jesus has been planting. I don't want to miss that point at all. These things are weeds, right? They're symbolized by weeds. Well, weeds aren't exactly friends to wheat. I mean, they're not friends to any plant. They suck the life out of them. So you have that very image there to remind us that as we are spreading throughout the world, like wheat in God's field, Satan is sowing these weeds that are trying to oppose us. There's very much this idea of hostility there. So very surprising, not only does the devil survive the coming of the Messiah, not only does he making children spring up throughout the world, but they are actually doing stuff against us. They are weeds. They are weeds, right? So you have all that. That's a very surprising idea. That's why I think we should focus on this idea, at least to some degree, that the children of the devil will continue to thrive alongside the children of the kingdom. There needs to be some kind of focus on that idea as we develop our main point. So that's why my main point, as I worded it, begins with, in spite of Satan's continuing hostility, right? That's where I'm getting that. I'm just trying to follow the keys of the parable, one of them being the surprising nature of it. So that's where I'm getting that. There's my first observation. Now my second one comes from the characters in the parable. I told you that very often you can learn something by following these characters, and that's what we're going to do next. Now, what we're going to learn is this. The children of the kingdom must wait for the children of the devil to be judged at the end of the age. The key word there being wait, and I guess the key phrase being the end of the age. But the idea there of patience, of waiting. Now, one of my pieces of advice was specifically that these characters in these parables very often will learn a lesson themselves. They themselves will learn something in the course of the parable. So you want to learn the same lesson they learned, right? If they're going to learn something, then you should be learning that thing too, right? You don't want to miss the point that is plainly given in the parable, do you? Okay, so learn from the characters. Verse 27 through verse 30 says, let's see here, and the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, An enemy has done this. So the servants said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, No, lest in gathering the weeds, you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Gather the weeds first and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. You see in this parable that these servants learn two things actually. So instead of one lesson from these guys, we learn two, I guess you could say. The first thing they learn is that there are now weeds growing in this field. Of course, we already knew that. The parable told us that, but they learn it for themselves, that Satan is on the move, that there are now these unbelievers springing up in God's kingdom. So that's the first thing they learn. The second thing they learn is that the faithful must wait to see the children of the devil destroyed. They want to say, well, should we go out there and start pulling up these weeds? And the master says, no, wait. Wait until the harvest. So they learn that they're going to have to wait. Now, this is, of course, not this is not what the faithful want to hear necessarily. Those of us who are actually following God and who are greatly disturbed by the hostility of unbelievers against us, we do not want to wait. No one likes waiting at all. Any kind of waiting is usually viewed in a negative way. We don't necessarily like learning patience, but especially not when your patience is also enduring, when you have an actual enemy working against you to your harm, and you have to just wait for him to be taken care of. You don't necessarily want these weeds to suck the life out of you as you're trying to grow in that field. So you don't necessarily want to hear that. The Christians don't glory in this idea that we have to put up with all this stuff. It's not a great thing for us, but that's what we're told to do. We are told to wait. And we get that as we learn from the characters in the parable. Again, just following one of these pieces of advice that I gave you, you learn from the characters, you learn what they learn, and we learn from them that the children of the kingdom must wait for the children of the devil to be judged at the end of the age. There is no immediate relief. We have to be patient, and we have to endure until the final judgment. At that time, God will deal with these weeds and with the one who planted them. Now I have one more observation to make here, one more piece of advice to apply. And on this one, we finally come back to my initial question regarding the incident that happened in Turkey with the team of missionaries and their clothing container. How do we endure it when people like that are trying to destroy the work of God? How do we put up with that? How do we endure the hostility when when Satan's people are so actively opposed to us? What do we do? Well, in this case, We learn from the end of the parable of the weeds. That's what we do. We're going to learn from the ending of the parable. And we're going to learn this. The children of the kingdom will be rewarded when the children of the devil are destroyed. So you get both ends of it there, both reward and destruction there at the end of the age. Now, in this case, we're talking about the end of the parable. You actually have two endings, technically, in this case, in this passage. You have the end of the story parable itself, and then you have the end of the interpretation, which Jesus gives, right? So you have two endings. You know, it's kind of a weird case, but oh well, we'll just play it out anyway. We're going to learn from the ending of both of those because they're both the same. Verse 30, ending of the parable. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first, and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So you have the gathering, the separation, the burning, and then the storing up in the barn. You have that. Well, the interpretation ends with the same events, this time giving them their meaning. We'll start in verse 40. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of the kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. So that's the ending of the parable, both the parable itself and the interpretation. Both coming back to this idea of the separation of the righteous and the wicked, and the judgment that awaits the wicked, and the reward of the righteous. Now, I've already indicated that Jesus focuses our attention on the wrath of God and the final judgment, but the reason for that really is twofold. First of all, it means that the devil's children eventually will be judged. Even if we have to wait for it, there is a reckoning coming. These people that have opposed the work of God, they will get what they deserve. They will get justice. They will get vengeful justice, in fact, when God finally reveals his wrath in that day. That is one reason Jesus has for stressing this. But there's another reason that so far I haven't really mentioned, and that is at that same time, at the final judgment, you get the reward for the children of the kingdom. You don't just get the wrath of God on these people over here, you get an abundant reward. And Jesus focuses on that as well when he gets to the end about this talk about the final judgment. Now, I think Jesus mentions the reward there because the reward functions as a great motivation for waiting, right? That's why I think he brings this up and doesn't just talk about how these weeds are going to be burned. He wants to give you a reason to endure. Whenever we're faced with a difficulty of any kind, at any point in the world, whatever it is, something at work, something at home, something with someone you know, doesn't matter. Anytime you encounter a difficulty, maybe a disease, maybe some kind of adverse circumstance, it doesn't matter. The chief question we're going to ask is this worthwhile? Is it worth my time and my effort and the stress and everything going into this to endure this? Should I just try to get out of it? Should I try to put it out of my mind? Or is it worthwhile for me to stand here and deal with this? Should I bother? Why should I bother? And whether we continue to endure something is going to depend upon how we answer that question. If we can answer that question with a good reason to endure, we will keep enduring. Otherwise, we'll probably give up. Now, in this parable, we see the difficulty. It's not hard to see the hardship that awaits us in this passage. Christians must endure the children of the devil, right? We have Satan going around causing trouble in the world, just as God is trying to create children of the kingdom in the world. And we have to wait for some future solution, right? There's no immediate gathering of the weeds to burn them. The weeds are going to be left there to grow among us, and we're going to have to deal with them. We're going to have to try to grow in spite of them. Now the question arises, is that worth it? Should we bother? Is all this stuff about enduring the hostility of the world really worth it? I mean, why should I care? Why should I bother? Why should I be persecuted? Why should I have people looking down on me just because I'm a Christian? Is this worthwhile? Well, Jesus does not fail to give you an answer. Yes, it is worthwhile, and he tells you why it is worthwhile. He brings up our future glorification, the glory that we are going to have when we are finally rewarded for all of our struggles at the final judgment. And that is our motivation to keep going. If you have no sense of altruism, just doing it because it is right, you can at least do it for the reward. So Jesus certainly gives you that in order to move you forward. Now, in his description of that reward, which is another important point. Jesus' description of that reward does not hold back. Jesus gives you something here that is actually very interesting. He implies that we are actually going to get the same glory that he possesses, right? When we get there to the final judgment, we get our reward, we're going to have a glory like his glory. Let me read what I'm talking about. Verse 43. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Shining like the sun. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, it's because that phrase is used somewhere else in Matthew's gospel, and in a very interesting place. Matthew 17. This is the transfiguration of Jesus. Matthew 17, verses 1 through 4. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to him Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So you have there that moment when Jesus is transfigured, his face shines like the sun, just as we're promised over there in Matthew 13. Jesus' face shining like the sun. Jesus was so glorious in that moment that Peter actually wanted to stay on that mountain indefinitely. He wanted to build houses up there, just stay up there. It was that good. Well, someday we will all be as Jesus was in that moment. Our faces will also shine like the sun, just as his did, if we are willing to wait for it, right? That's the key there. If you are willing to endure that hostility, if you are willing to endure the troubles that are being caused by Satan, you will get exactly what Jesus had. You will have that kind of glory. So the privilege of being a disciple, even as there is so much difficulty to it and so much hardship to overcome, the privilege of being a disciple is very, very great. Matthew's been stressing that theme throughout this chapter, and he does so here. Here the privilege is Christ-like glory. Here you get to be like Jesus, not only in moral character, but in terms of the glory that God gave him. The same glory that God gave him is the glory that you're going to have too, if you endure all these things. So, when we learn from the end of the parable, both the parable and its interpretation, that is, when we learn from the end of the parable, we see that the children of the kingdom will be rewarded when the children of the devil are destroyed. And that rounds out my reasoning behind taking the parable the way I do and focusing on the main point that I have. So, again, just to state that for you, in spite of Satan's continuing hostility, Christians should wait for the judgment when God will reward them. All I got that by stringing together these observations, applying these different forms of advice, learning from the surprise, learning from the characters, learning from the ending, just parable interpretation 101, following basically what I said at the very beginning. That's how we get the main point of this parable. And it doesn't really have anything to do with warnings about false believers. It has more to do with waiting for the final judgment, looking forward to the reward, in spite of all this hostility that Satan is going to throw at us by creating these unbelievers. So that's the way I understand the parable. Now I'm just going to summarize all that for you again, just so we're very clear here. Don't want to turn over too many presuppositions and leave you wondering what I was saying. We'll summarize all this, make a final application, then we'll be done. Okay, so first of all, again, whole first half of the message, I really don't think the primary purpose of this parable is to warn us against false believers. It's very common to take it that way. I don't necessarily fault them for understanding the weeds as being false believers. I think there are problems with that. I just don't think it's the main point, mainly because of Jesus' interpretation, right? In the interpretation offered by Jesus, he doesn't focus on that idea. He doesn't focus on false believers. He doesn't focus on a warning about false believers. He focuses your attention elsewhere. So, I don't really think we should understand the parable that way. Again, I have my doubts about whether the weeds even represent false believers. But even if they do, I just don't think that's the main purpose of the parable. So there was the first half. Now again, my main idea was that in spite of Satan's continuing hostility against the people of God, Christians should wait for the final judgment when God will reward us. We learned that first of all from the surprise in the parable. The Jews were expecting this immediate great end of all evil whenever the Messiah came. Instead, we see that the children of the devil will continue to thrive alongside the children of the kingdom. So that's a great surprise. We want to learn from that. Secondly, learn from the characters of the parable. The servants of the master in the parable learn something. They learn that we have to wait for the end of the age for the devil and his servants to be judged, right? That's what they were learning in the parable, so we're going to learn that as well. That's also part of my main point. Also, the ending of the parable doesn't just focus on the final judgment, but on the reward of the righteous, on the Christ-like glory that we're going to have whenever the final judgment happens. So that also needs to be part of our main idea. So that's where we get this idea. The primary purpose of this parable, I think, is to encourage us against this continuing hardship provided by the devil, encouraging us to wait for the final judgment when God will set things right, and motivating us to do that by appealing to the reward that we are going to have. That's the way I build the meaning of this parable. Now, I, for my part, although it was very difficult to see a standard interpretation of mine overthrown as I was studying it and changing my mind so greatly on what the parable means, I actually am rather glad that the parable means what I now think it means and not what I used to think it meant, because I think it has a better application. I think we get more out of it. If we assume that the parable is a warning about false believers, all of the applications become rather depressing, to be honest with you. It's just not very uplifting. I know I don't usually focus on uplifting things, but come on. Okay, parable, let's say the meaning is you have these false believers in our midst. What is the application? Don't get too fond of your friends because some of them are false. Watch your back. Judas is everywhere. I mean, you don't get these really nice points here that you can really take and go with. I mean, yeah, it's useful to know that, but not a lot of application there. But if you understand the parable as an encouragement to persevere, I think it becomes more powerful, because you are always going to deal with that. Satan is going to guarantee that there is always some weed planted right next to you causing you harm. He's going to make sure of that. And you need to have something at that time to know how to deal with that. You have to have some knowledge from Christ for how to deal with that hostility when it comes. So, here you are, you're enduring this mockery, you're enduring the slander, unfair treatment, maybe even martyrdom in some places of the world. I mean, you're enduring all those things. How do you deal with that? Well, we have a great consolation that someday God is going to wipe the earth clean of all those weeds, and He is going to glorify us and reward us for our patience. And you can always apply the lesson of the parable to that. You're always going to be enduring something. The lesson of this parable is always applicable to you. It's always going to be relevant. So, as your frustrations grow at the hostilities of the world, I think you should remember the parable of the weeds of the field. Right? I think it is very relevant to what we endure as Christians. So that is my advice to you on how to understand the parable. Now, hopefully my arguments were clear and hopefully convincing. I know for some of you, again, that's kind of a 180 for how to read the parable. It certainly was for me. If you have questions, I really want to deal with them. Further comments, I'd be interested to hear if anyone else was thinking the same way I was, but whatever. Does anyone have anything to add or attack in the message? I will not construe your hostility as coming from the devil.